Hi, my name is Ivy Roberts, and I'm presenting on the topic of archival finding aids for primary sources and historical documents. Some of the questions I'm going to be posing in this presentation are: what are finding aids? How are they used? What form do they take? How are finding aids accessed? I'm going to discuss a 2019 article by Weideman. And finally, what are current trends in literature about finding aids? So to start off, it helps to understand the concept, structure, and purpose of the finding aid in the context of the archive. First of all, how does an archive differ from a library? Libraries use card catalogs because they arrange their material by content, and libraries organize books on an item level by subject. This is a system we should all be familiar with. For example, using the McKeldin Library Catalog, you can search for books by keyword and pull up the location and call number of a book. Well, archives function differently from libraries. Instead of organizing by subject on an item level, archives are arranged by provenance, that is, by context and origin. This approach is called respect d'enfant, a principle in archival theory. So archives are most commonly arranged at the collection level. Or stated another way, archivists aim to preserve the provenance or origin of collections that have been acquired from specific sources. Say, for example, that a donor bequeaths their estate library and personal papers to the University of Maryland Archives and Special Collections. All of these materials will then be inspected by a university archivist and inventoried as a self-contained collection. That is, materials will not be disseminated into a general collection by subject as it would in a library. Ultimately, the archivist's inventory will result in the production of a finding aid, which is the equivalent of the library card catalog entry for a book. And within a collection, you can expect to then find boxes or containers in which the material has been arranged according to the collection's internal structure. In the literature on finding aids, the structure of the collection-based archive is referred to as hierarchical. That is, archives most often arrange their materials at the level of collection and then demarcate the items downward in levels according to box and container. Now, this structure contributes to a great deal of confusion and frustration on the part of researchers who are attempting to access those materials. And this is the detriment of the finding aid format, which I will expand on in the second part of this presentation. So in a broader sense, finding aids are a standardized form of archival descriptive materials. That is, over the course of the 20th century, the finding aid became the standard way for archivists to inventory and provide access to archival materials. The current trend in literature about archival finding aids today has to do with the limitations of the genre. In the words of Richard J. Cox, a professor of archival studies at the University of Pittsburgh, no matter how complex archival finding aids might become, it seems unlikely that they can represent effectively all of the layers, details, nuances, and vagaries that constitute records. The second part of this presentation gets into more detail about the limitations of finding aids and the historical development of the document genre. So, archivists are the physical medium through which the researchers gain access to materials. Cox reminisces about his experience in archives in the 1970s, writing, "When one came across a description reading, 'located near water bucket in basement,' no one panicked. All you did was check to make sure that the box of records was still not there." This anecdote highlights the idiosyncrasy of the finding aid format, as well as hinting at its evolution over time, reflecting the state of art of archival descriptive materials. Today, finding aids are predominantly found online in searchable databases. On the left here, you see an EAD formatted archival finding aid that's encoded archival description. And this is an XML-based coding standard that functions to provide searchable access through archival databases. According to Weideman, quote, surveys in 2008 and 2017-18 found EAD implementation rates of over 50% and 80% respectively, and today's American archivists likely manage a majority of archival collections in EAD or an archival management system. In many cases, researchers will also come across early forms of the finding aid. At the Library of Congress, for example, their database also provides earlier formats of the finding aid, like the PDF or print version on the right side of the slide here. But I should also note that both of these types of finding aids are considered online formats. In either case, the archival finding aid consists of 7 or so standardized components: title page, summary information, access and use, background information, scope, content and arrangement, subject terms, and content listing. To give you a bit of context into the debate over archive access and usability of finding aids, I have this example for you. I had a pretty good idea of what I was looking for when I went to look at the Herbert Ives papers at the Library of Congress in 2016, but I had no way to know what I would find in those boxes. For example, my main search topic was television, but it was not in the index terms for the collection. So I found 2 boxes in that collection that contained numerous documents pertaining to Ives's research at Bell Labs in the late 1930s in the development of television technologies that proved to be pivotal to my dissertation research. So pictured here is an invitation to the 25th anniversary of television at Bell Labs, and it is items of this type that will not appear in the archival finding aid. Here I used the collection request slip as a size reference, actually. So you can see that this form, the collection request form, is actually another level of mediation between the finding aid, the researcher, the archivist, and the collection. So how are finding aids accessed? I've provided links to 3 representative archives here, for example, the Library of Congress, the University of Maryland Archives, and ArchiveGrid, which provides access to collections and repositories across the world. The article I chose to present is entitled "The Historical Hazards of Finding Aids" by Greg Wiedemann. Wiedemann is the university archivist at the SUNY Albany Archives and Special Collections. Wiedemann has a twofold purpose for writing. First, he provides a big picture history of the finding aid as a document genre. He looks back to the origins of the genre in the 1930s and 1940s at the National Archives and traces the development of the finding aid to current practice in EAD. Secondly, Wiedemann is preoccupied with the detriments of the finding aid, specifically as barriers to usability. So in order to support his overall argument that the finding aid is an historically entrenched format, Wiedemann spends the bulk of his 30 pages outlining its dense history. In the 1930s and 40s, the National Archives experimented with subject-level description and a card catalog, but this method proved to be ultimately unfeasible. Writes Wiedemann, quote, "From the start, finding aids were a creative compromise between scale and usability. The National Archives ultimately adopted the model of provenance." Problems with standardization of form and format quickly became apparent when archivists attempted to implement computerized file management beginning in the 1970s. The Society of American Archivists led standardization efforts aiming to shift from localized description methods to a national system. And in 1977, the SAA established the National Information Systems Task Force, or NISTIF, to explore ways to standardize archival description using computerized methods. In the 1980s, NISTIF recommended and implemented the MARC-AMC standard, a bibliographic cataloging network for archives and manuscript control. So in the early 1990s, a Berkeley-based group began researching ways to implement XML and HTML to transform archival access. According to Wiedemann, quote, "On the face of it, EAD and XML in general seemed like a perfect fit for archives. Not only was it hierarchical, but it maintained the same document paradigm for finding aids. At this point, the barriers to usability begin to become overwhelmingly clear. And in the 2000s, the discourse of archival descriptive material shifts from one of standardization to one of user-friendliness. But in sum, the EAD format made finding aids searchable while providing a universal format for the structure of archival descriptive materials. So what are the article's main findings? Wiedemann's article reveals current trends in literature about finding aids. For one thing, archival finding aids are described as dual function documents. They are developed by archivists as internal forms for inventory, and they are also functional on the external level as discovery tools for researchers. Wiedemann describes, quote, "From the beginning, archivists used finding aids to combine multiple functions within a single tool. Archivists created description, managed it, and presented it to users all by using finding aids." Wiedemann points out that the archival finding aid and archival descriptive materials are not synonymous. Quote, "By the 1990s, finding aids became actively detrimental as they framed the creation of encoded archival descriptive standard. And it is more appropriate to describe EAD as encoding finding aids rather than encoding archival description. Finding aids as they exist today are the result of a long struggle between standardization and searchability. That is to say, the finding aid became an entrenched standard that is both a help and a hindrance to archival access. Therefore, two main problems arise: structure and terminology. Yackel 2004 observes, quote, "Archival jargon is a major issue for users of primary sources." In conclusion, I just have three main points that I would like to offer to highlight as takeaways from this presentation. Firstly, from their origin in the 1930s, American archives have been arranged based on collection as opposed to a library's item level description. Collections maintain the provenance or context of their material. Today, the EAD, encoded archival description format, is the standard for searching and accessing finding aids. Second, searchable databases like ArchiveGrid give researchers access to EAD formatted finding aids representative of collections across the world. And third, finding aids continue to pose problems for archival access. The literature suggests that archivists still have a lot of room for improvement of finding aids in taking full advantage of the XML-based EAD format to promote usability. Thank you. Here are my references.